Hello, everybody. My name is Jennifer Pai, and I'm happy to have here with me today Nitea Naulivu from Fiji and Beth Sprund from Australia. Nitea works as a senior education officer in special and inclusive education at the Ministry of Education, Heritage and Arts in Fiji. And Beth works as a senior fellow at the University of Melbourne. And I'm very happy to have them here today, and I'm going to give Nitea now a few minutes to introduce herself and her work in Fiji. Nitea.
Hi everyone, my name is Nitea Naulivu, and I am the Senior Education Officer for Special and Inclusive Education here at the Ministry of Education, Heritage and Arts in Fiji. My role involves administering special and inclusive schools around the country. There's about 17 special schools altogether and about 43 inclusive schools, the schools that children with special needs go to after they transit from special schools.
Great, thank you. Beth, do you want to take a few minutes to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I suppose that my work here in Fiji has come through 2 Australian aid funded programs, education sector programs. The first one was Access to Quality Education program, and that's where we first met, and that's probably where the bulk of the development of the EMIS disaggregation work happened. But these days I'm employed through another Australian aid funded program called the Fiji Program Support Facility. So we get to continue the work in partnership with the Ministry of Education. And fortunately, because we did a lot of work to make sure that we could validly and accurately identify children with disabilities who were in schools that hadn't already been identified, and then make sure that that fits well within the Fiji Education Management Information System. Which requires ongoing work, really, to make sure that the development of this system is actually bedded in and implemented and rolled out effectively.
Great, thank you, Beth. So as participants can hear, we're going to talk about EMIS, Fiji's EMIS, which is called FEMIS. So it's about education management information systems to basically see how they can be made more inclusive for children with disabilities. So both Beth and Nitea have been working on this for a number of years. So we're going to hear about their experience today. And so I'm really happy that they were available. We have a couple of questions that we want to put to them. So the first question, I believe Beth is willing to respond to that one. What motivated Fiji to redesign its education management information system to be more inclusive, and what was the goal of the project?
So when we were first working on the project back in around 2012, we were looking to make sure that the disability inclusive education work and the programming to support the rollout of the ministry's inclusive education objectives was based on solid data, and we had a look at the existing data, and it was very clear to everyone that it wasn't really very valid or accurate. So basically it was based on a series of questions or boxes that teachers had to tick, which was just around impairment categories, and not very many sort of teachers kind of should be expected to have the skills to work out whether a child has an impairment, whether it's hearing impairment versus an intellectual disability. There's lots of impairment categories that can be confused if you are not trained, and teachers are trained in other areas. So it wasn't surprising, but it was important for us to kind of draw a line in the sand and realise we can't actually use the data, it's not working. And so given that the ministry had these strong aspirations to shift from not only really servicing and working closely with the 17 special schools, but trying to work, on this inclusive education policy, which needed to push out into the mainstream schools. But I suppose because there wasn't any formal way of knowing and tracking where the children with disabilities were in all of the mainstream schools, the system couldn't accommodate that because it didn't have accurate data. There was this barrier to actually implementing that inclusive education policy. So we decided through the program, the ACEP program, that we would do some solid work in looking at, right, well, what is a tool that we can use to try and shift away into more functional categories, which teachers are good at observing children and using functional categories around disability. So given that the UNICEF and Washington Group child functioning module was already kind of in development, and we're very familiar with the adult set of questions, so we knew that the child functioning module, we had a rough idea of how that might look. We decided, well, let's see if we can get permission, because it was in early days before it was finalised. So we got permission with the penultimate draft of the child functioning module, and we did a fairly solid research piece. So I actually dropped out of being an advisor on the program and decided to do a PhD on it, which was a diagnostic accuracy approach. So basically, we took the responses that teachers gave to the child functioning module questions and compared the answers to clinical assessments of those children. And similarly, we interviewed the children's parents using the child functioning module, and we compared their responses to the clinical assessments, and then looked at sensitivity and specificity of those CFM questions. So we kind of took the research fairly seriously and decided, right, we need to know whether we're getting the right children when we use this tool. And I think probably an important element of contextualising this is that Fiji's desire was to use the data not only to make sort of reporting against general objectives or sustainable development goals or EFA indicators. They really wanted to use the FEMIS data to determine whether that child was eligible for the new special and inclusive education grant. So schools would be, in theory, they would be using that data to make an application for funding for that child. So accuracy was very, very important to the ministry. So we went ahead and we realised that probably the way the child functioning module questionnaire works, it's just a series of questions which is more designed for a survey. So we reshaped that into something that would be more useful and practical for teachers into a matrix, which ultimately over time is something the teachers become familiar with as they're checking it against multiple students, and they can do it relatively efficiently. I think I'll stop there because I can go on, as most PhD students could just go on for hours. So I'll pause and let you jump in if you've got any more observations to make, Litea.
Sure, no, I mean, that's quite an in-depth explanation there. So thank you very much, Beth. How long did that process take you?
Well, so the data collection was a period of 4 to 5 months. So there was data collected from all parts around Fiji, both from some of the impairment groups, children with vision impairments and hearing impairments. It's hard to get adequate sample size just from mainstream schools. So we definitely had to go to the special schools, particularly for those groups, to get enough numbers. But then we also covered a range of, just mainstream primary schools.
Okay, great. So what were then the major challenges in designing and implementing this new FEMIS?
I suppose that so firstly, Fiji's EMIS is an online system, and every child has their own unique identification number. And so that enables you to use this disability data incredibly compared to a more census-based EMIS, which might just be filled in by the head teacher once a year. on more like a survey, whereas this is an online live system, so that every time you have new data on it, you might identify that a child has disability at any time during the year, and you can just upload that onto the system. So that basically means that, you know, putting all of the work in is so worth it, because you have data on that child for their whole school career, and actually here in Fiji, that same unique identifier goes right through to university. So it provides a lot of amazing information. However, in the development, I guess one of the challenges is you really need to build in enough time to work closely with the IT people within the Ministry of Education, and we've been very, very lucky here in Fiji. The information technology people and the programmers and designers of that system are very, very open, and they've been very generous in helping us to understand coding so that we can interpret what we need from our disability data into algorithms that make sense within the system.
Was the system already that way before, or did you completely change the system with this new introduction of data?
No, so it was already making a shift back in 2011 or 2012?
2011.
2011, the ministry anyway had decided to make a shift into an online system. So they were investing a lot of time, money, etc., into building this really incredible system. And so this is where we saw the opportunity to, you know, as long as we were confident that the disability identification was accurate, you know, if you can tag a student file with that information, then you're allowed, you know, you're enabled to kind of cut the data in many ways. You can see their, you know, their learning progress in literacy and numeracy. You can see their attendance rates very easily. You can see whether they've moved from a special school to a mainstream school to a secondary school or backwards. You know, you can track transitions very easily. So we saw the potential of this amazing system, and we thought, let's work hard to get the disability data really accurate.
Now, the fact that, Fiji is obviously an island and a group of islands, and it's a fairly small population compared to obviously a lot of the other countries that will be listening to you. So has that been a huge advantage for innovating?
Yeah. I mean, I think so. However, I'm also working on a program, an education sector program in Indonesia, and that's the polar opposite. You know, that has an enormous population, 280 million people, and they're doing a very similar thing right now. So I think that innovation can happen in many different types of places. It's very much about the design of the system and who's in there working on that, and how committed is the ministry to its system. You probably would, you'd have to be very careful to contextualise your efforts depending on the type of system. We would have looked at this quite differently if it were a census-based system. You'd still use the child functioning module, but you wouldn't be able to come down to that level of accuracy that we've been able to achieve through the algorithms.
Okay, good. So now let's talk a little bit about the teachers, who are probably the key stakeholders in all this. So how comfortable are the teachers in filling out the forms? Do they feel it is helpful to them?
Yes, the tool is something that they find user-friendly. Normally we refer to it as the SLP, which stands for Students Learning Profile. It's quite useful to the teachers because we have actually trained them to use this form. So prior to them filling the forms, there was a series of training that the ministry had conducted. The first lot of training was to the district education officers. We have 9 education districts around the country. So we had to get all the senior education officers from the 9 education districts, and then we trained them on how to fill the forms. And also there is a part that they need to to do, which is the verification of the disability on this FAMIS system, on this tool. So after training the district education officers, we then trained the heads of schools, both of primary schools and secondary schools, so that we are also able to capture the data, the desegregation data at all levels, from ECE, primary, and also secondary. So we trained the teachers. So those series of training took about 3 to 4 years, from 2015, 16, 17, and we covered the remote schools last year and this year as well. So the teachers have been using the form, filling in the necessary information that is required of the form. And the feedback that we have received is that it has been useful to them, because the tool actually rules out the other factors, and it just allows them to focus on the specific disability area or the challenges that the child is finding difficulty in. So, and it has also helped us to make informed decisions on what type of support or reasonable accommodation that is needed to be given to the students who have been verified as having a disability and that needed the support of the ministry.
Okay, great. Thank you. So is there any early feedback on how the FAMIS is affecting the educational or other services that children are getting in Fiji today?
Yes, as I've mentioned earlier on, we are using the data that we gather from this tool to make decisions on what kind of support and what level of support should be given to the students, particularly the giving out of the special education grant that's supposed to be given to every student who have a disability, to sort of support them in terms of resources and other facilities that they would be needing. So this data helps us to determine what kind of support is needed, and also whether it is resources or whether it is reasonable accommodations in terms of examinations. So right now, what we are looking at after the completion of the examinations this year, we have received information that to our students who have received reasonable accommodations in terms of the provision of support during exams have successfully passed their exams. So that is one of the advantages of getting the data and identifying those students out there who really needs support in those areas. So the data has been useful to us. Not only that, it also has given us a step up to what we used to be in the past. In the past, we were only limiting our resources, the deployment of our resources to the special schools and to only certain known cases, those with physical impairment and hearing impairment. But now with the use of data, we are also reaching out to those with learning disabilities and intellectual disabilities, those students that are in mainstream schools. So yes, we are able to deploy the necessary resources and services that needs to be given to them.
Do you think, Litea, the fact of having this kind of data now has strengthened the coordination between different services and ministries?
Yes, with this data, we are able to convincingly mention the support that is needed from education in order for the other ministries to complement our services. So as mentioned earlier on, in the past, our data has never been so reliable, so to speak, with this tool, the desegregation tool available on FEMIS, it's available to all our schools. So even students in our ECE, primary, secondary, are able to access this tool and fill in the SLP. And we are able to get a holistic view of what is needed in terms of their learning needs throughout the nation. So with that, we are able to give in what is required from the Ministry of Health or the Ministry of Social Welfare in terms of support that is needed by these students.
So sure, Beth, yeah.
Sorry. I was having a conversation with one of Latea's colleagues this morning. So there's a non-government organisation who is able to provide audiology and some therapies and some early intervention services and screening services. And they've realised that within this same system, there's this part 2 of the student learning profile, which is not compulsory. It doesn't affect the determination of disability, but we built it in anyway, which enables the data entry of clinical conditions and also enables, so ideally you would have the teacher and the parent, the child if that's relevant, or maybe there's a sign language interpreter, or maybe there's a teacher aide. Relevant people would come together to fill out the student learning profile, just in case that information provokes a nice conversation about learning support needs. So within that, it's often an opportunity for that group to be considering what referrals might be relevant. So we built in a system by which you can record what we think the clinical issue is, and then you can tick on there's lots of drop-down lists around which services maybe the child should be referred for. And then post service or post the referral, then there's another section which you can report on services that have been provided. So it's nice that we built it in a couple of years ago, and it hasn't really taken off. It's been more just the ministry has been focusing on rolling out the actual identification of the children and making sure they're getting the grant out to the right schools. But it's nice that even without pushing too hard for this next section to be used, there's already a demand for it. So yeah, that's something that again this online system enables.
Okay, and that sort of automatically leads into the question that I suppose the budget has followed, because I mean, the more you identify particular needs, the more it has implications on the budget. So has the ministry been forthcoming on this side?
Yes, we after the identification process, we use that data to sort of make submissions for an increased budget, and for the past 3 years, our budget has increased. So yes, so we are picking up on those needs and considering it to be a priority for the special education grant to be given out to the schools that need it.
Great, great. So let's come to the last question. So if you had to give advice to other ministries of education in moving towards more inclusive education management information systems, could both of you each list the 3 top priorities that you see that you would like to share?
For me, I would say that data is important for us to make informed decisions in terms of rolling out inclusive education, because I think with the right data we can deploy resources accordingly, and that's going to save a lot of money as well. And it's also important, secondly, to train the teachers, the district education officers, and the whole of the Ministry of Education to realize the importance of getting this desegregated data in EMIS, because there's a lot of levels of reporting that is required, and we've got to be making sure that the data we have is compounded and also that the services that needs to go out to the children should be given out, because that's something that they rightfully deserve. And I think finally, it's also important for this data to be captured, because we are able to track the system. We are able to track the progress of our students. So much has been mentioned about inclusion, but if we are not able to track, if we are not able to provide continuous support, then I think it is not a very good idea. Everything will be wasted. So that is why the data is important, because we need to track, and we need to continuously provide the support that they need.
And maybe my turn. So I guess the top three, probably, using functional categorization, functional observation of children is much more aligned with teacher competencies and capacity. And certainly our experience is that it's much more valid and accurate. So that's in line with the Washington Group UNICEF Child Functioning Module approach. So definitely, if you're going to be collecting data on children with disabilities, then shift away from an impairment approach to a functioning difficulty approach. That's definitely the top one. I suppose being aware that, dragging one model or idea from somewhere else and trying to squash it onto your own MS is probably not a great idea. So you need to have a think about what it is that your ministry's MS is based on. Is it once a year of a survey style, which is actually very, very common, or is it these increasingly countries are shifting to an online system? So firstly you need to start by looking at that, and there are recommended ways. UNICEF has guidelines on how you can disaggregate a census-based system, survey-based system. So there are ways of doing it, and obviously that's your starting point. And a third bit of advice, I suppose you have to be in this for a long game. This is not a simple matter of getting a consultant in for a couple of months. That I don't think that's going to work. I think this is something that the ministry has to take on seriously. It has to link with the policy. We had to make sure that the categories and the levels of difficulty were then matched within the policy's own guidelines on what funding was going to be provided. So there's quite a bit of thinking that needs to happen to make sure that the disaggregation is really interlinked with existing systems and policies of each ministry in its own context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. Thank you so much to both of you. I think we're coming to the end of this interview. So I think you provided a lot of very, very rich information for our participants. Do you have any additional comments that you want to put out there that you feel you didn't get a chance to address? I mean, you don't have to.
I suppose there's a couple of short videos on the Fiji Ministry of Education's website. There's a tab that's Special and Inclusive Education Resources. So there's a couple of videos there. There's the guidance. It's called the FEMIS Disability Disaggregation Package, and so that gives you step-by-step guidance. It's the target audience is obviously Fiji, but it might be useful as well for you to refer to that. There's also lots of other good resources on the ministry's website under that tab. So yeah, go for it and see if that's of any use.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much to both of you for having given our participants an opportunity to listen to your experience. Thank you, and good luck with your work. Bye bye.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.